Welcome back to Physical Anthropology. Today we're looking at our last chapter of the textbook, which is chapter 16, focusing on contemporary topics including human biology and health. So what we're going to look at today is how diet changes have impacted health and compare the pre-agricultural versus post-agricultural populations, as well as how sedentarism in modern times causes obesity. Then we'll look at the major epidemiological transitions, including how domesticated animals have increased the incidence of zoonotic illnesses and how infectious diseases compare with modern populations compared to our ancestors. So what happened in terms of diet changes? Our ancestors, we know, are heterotrophic and omnivorous. What that means is heterotrophic is true for all animals. It means they have to eat to get their energy. They can't make their own food, which is autotrophic. That's what plants do. So we have to consume either plants or animals or some combination. And if you're an omnivore, it means you're a generalized eater. You eat plant matter, you also eat animal matter, you also might eat fungus, you might eat, nuts, berries, basically whatever you can find. One interesting thing is that we definitely have a predisposition to enjoy foods that are salty, sugary, or fatty. And this has to do with survival. So things that taste sweet bring pleasure and enjoyment because a high concentration of sugar will give you more calories. Similarly, fatty foods are going to provide you with more calories, and therefore you don't have to find as many of those food items. Salt is a micronutrient, so it's something that we need to maintain our water balance and our blood pressure in our bodies. But salt is something that can be obtained from regular food. It doesn't necessarily have to be added. It can be already in the items that you are eating. So our pre-agricultural ancestors would have been hunter-gatherers, they would have been foragers, and they had a very wide range of foods that they ate. That's because they went from location to location. They ate things that were in season at that time, whatever fruit or nuts were available. They would have hunted animals. And in general, they would have eaten more protein and less fat because the wild game tends to be leaner. So our modern domesticated animals have a lot higher concentration of fat because they're just kind of sitting around in a farm versus the wild game, which would have been necessarily like herd animals that are moving around and therefore are very lean. We also would have had more fiber, which you can find in plant matter, and we would have had less sodium. As I said, they wouldn't have been adding salt to their diet. It would have been whatever is already found in the food. We also wouldn't have any processed food or addition of things like corn syrup, which is basically sugar. After the agricultural revolution, which occurred around 10,000 years ago, there were some major changes in our diet. So the good news is that we were getting plenty of calories. There wasn't as much risk of starvation because you were growing food. And so you knew that in a couple weeks or months, you would have plenty of these plant products to eat. You might be raising your own cattle or pigs, which you could later eat. So you weren't as worried about the source of your food. However, they did not provide the same nutritional value. And that's because the types of food people ate became much more narrow and much more concentrated on the specific crops that they were growing and the specific animals that they were raising. We also, of course, see that there's an increase in the sugar content of food. Again, sugar is something that people find pleasurable to eat. But when you consume a lot of sugar, what it does is it creates more bacterial growth in your mouth. And this is going to result in more cavities. Modern day meat farms are also adding things to the animal that wouldn't exist in wild game. So for example, antibiotics are often fed to these animals because they are in close proximity to each other and we want to keep them healthy. They may be provided with growth hormones to make them mature faster and build up muscle mass faster. They're going to be higher in fat and cholesterol because, as I said, the farm animals aren't wandering around like their ancestors would have. And there's also higher cancer risks to many of these foods. So in the chart on the right, you can see that things like processed meats, which add a lot of salts and different chemical preservatives, have a much higher risk of causing cancer than other types of foods. Now, the hominin adaptations of our ancestors were specifically for endurance running. So we talked about how we had that bipedal body shape, and we also sweat to reduce our body heat. But in modern lifestyle, we're not running around or hunting or following our game. Instead, we're primarily sedentary, meaning we're staying in one location. And if you get to really modern lifestyles, most people spend the majority of their day sitting, whether it's sitting during their commute to work or sitting in an office. So they're not walking around, not burning as many calories as they used to in the past. What this has done is created a huge epidemic in obesity. 1.9 billion people in the world are now categorized as at least overweight. Obese, the difference between overweight and obese depends on your body mass index. So there is actually a scientific definition of these categories. And if you look up a BMI chart based on your age and on your sex, whether you're male or female, you can see where you fall on that chart. So if you fall in the obese category, it's going to increase your risk for a bunch of different health consequences. And in America, in the last 50 years or so, we've seen this huge increase in overweight and obesity rates. So let's take a look more at what happens with obesity. We mentioned that part of it is the sedentary lifestyle and also easy access to high calorie but low nutritional value foods. So one thing you can do to fight obesity is simply making sure you get some exercise and that you watch your diet. So with exercise, even as little as 20 to 30 minutes of moderate exercise a day will help you maintain your weight. And then in terms of the types of foods, eating more nutritionally rich foods like fresh fruits, and then limiting the meat consumption, especially of that fatty type of meat like the red meats that we see. So what happens to a person who's obese? On the right, you can see a whole list of different possible consequences. So we know it impacts your circulatory system, specifically the heart is very much impacted, and heart disease is the #1 killer in the United States. So definitely something to consider. It takes time for this to develop. It doesn't happen overnight. It's after years and years of poor diet and overweight or obesity. It also influences your endocrine system. That's going to be the system that is involved with hormone production. So we see a higher incidence of diabetes in people who are obese due to the fact that they are not utilizing insulin properly. And then your skeletal system can be impacted. You're going to have a higher risk for arthritis because your body is not, your skeletal system did not evolve to support such a large weight. And especially in this bipedal posture, your knees and your ankles have a lot of stress on them if you're obese. So some different specific illnesses that obesity contributes to include hypertension, which is high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, as I mentioned, including the risk for heart attacks, stroke, that's due to lack of blood flow in the brain, diabetes, which I mentioned, where you cannot control your blood sugar. Specifically, the kind of diabetes we're looking at is type 2 diabetes. There is something called type 1 diabetes that has a genetic predisposition where the person is not able to produce insulin at all. And that is not necessarily due to their diet, while type 2 diabetes is more associated with insulin resistance, which does develop due to diet. And then osteoarthritis, which I mentioned, as well as higher risk of cancers. So now let's look at some vocabulary term that deals with epidemiology. Epidemiology is the study of the incidence, distribution, transmission, and control of diseases. And we're very interested in these diseases because we want to know how we can prevent them or how we can limit them or reduce them. Two terms that sound very familiar, very similar to each other are morbidity versus mortality. Morbidity is basically the number of people who have symptomatic disease at a specific time. In comparison, mortality is the number of deaths attributed to that disease. So morbidity would be a higher number because it would include all the cases versus mortality would only be the individuals who died from that specific illness. Two other terms that are often confused with each other are incidence versus prevalence. Incidence is specifically the number of new cases versus prevalence is the total number of cases at a given period of time. And these two numbers give us different information. So if you see that incidence is decreasing, for example, it will give you insight on the idea that maybe prevention techniques are improving. Prevalence, on the other hand, if prevalence is increasing, it means that more and more people are getting that disease. If prevalence is decreasing, it might be that people are recovering from the illness, but it could also be that they are dying from the illness because once the mortality numbers are there, they're subtracted from that prevalence. There are three main epidemiological transitions in human history. So let's go over what these were. The first is the transition to agriculture, which we previously stated. So the move from that nomadic lifestyle of hunter-gatherer to a sedentary lifestyle with growing your own plants and domesticating animals. We've stated previously that this increases your risk of dental disease, including cavities. We're also going to have a higher risk of nutritional deficiencies due to the limited nutritional value of these foods. We're going to see an increase in infectious disease. This is because of our proximity to animals, which also can have disease, as well as our proximity to each other, because we would be living in larger social groups. Skeletal conditions such as osteoarthritis historically would not have been associated with obesity, but would have been due to the hard physical labor required in farming and in carrying things. So that's why our ancestral species would have had that. And we also see decreases in growth and height. The second epidemiological transition was the Industrial Revolution. Here, some good news is that we actually increased the standard of living for most people and that hygiene was improved. Historically, people did not understand what was causing disease, so the germ theory of disease is relatively new, and improving hygiene, including things like introducing sewer systems, helped to decrease infections amongst those populations. However, we will see the rise of non-communicable diseases. Those are diseases that are not infectious in nature. The third epidemiological transition is happening right now. And the idea is that in the early 1900s, when, for example, antibiotics were first discovered, they were very effective at killing bacteria. We also started creating vaccines, which helped prevent very infectious diseases like measles, whooping cough, polio, and the incidence of those diseases rapidly declined. So we thought we won. We thought humans won against microorganisms, and we don't really have any natural predators anymore, so it sounded great. But because of the huge increase in human population, we're contributing now to climate change. Climate change is changing the range of certain historical diseases. We're also seeing, due to evolution, the development of antibiotic resistance in many infectious diseases. So drug resistance is something that's becoming a major health concern. A disease which is considered to be more of an ancient historical disease, tuberculosis, is now making a comeback where you're getting not just regularly drug resistant, but multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. Our modern medications can't kill it anymore. Malaria is also another disease that historically killed, millions and millions of people. And modern day prevention techniques, including prophylactic drugs, mosquito control by using pesticides, those were all working, except again, due to evolution, now the malaria parasite is becoming drug resistant, and some of those mosquitoes are becoming resistant to the pesticides. So malaria is definitely making a comeback. We also see some novel diseases appearing. So these are new diseases that we do not have historical context for. Things like Ebola, HIV/AIDS, only discovered in the 1980s, and some other illnesses like dengue fever and West Nile virus. So where are they coming from? A lot of these are found in wild animal populations, and it's our encroachment of those habitats and destruction of the habitats and interaction with these wild animals, which is causing the jump from species to species. So the pathogen which used to only infect one species is now making humans its new host. We definitely have an increased risk of pandemics. This is due to the chance of global travel, right? So historically, humans got around by walking. Then they might have started using things like horses, building ships, but all of those are relatively slow methods of travel. Nowadays, you can hop on a plane and go to the complete opposite side of the world within a 24-hour period. So this global travel increases the risk of transmitting illnesses much faster. Climate change, which we have now associated with human interaction with the environment, is going to increase the geographical ranges of certain vectors. So for example, malaria is spread by mosquitoes. And so historically would only impact those populations who live in tropical areas that the mosquito lives in. but because of increased global warming, the range of the mosquito is spreading. And so areas which historically did not have malaria now are showing incidences of malaria because the mosquitoes can live there. Okay, here's the review question for you. Morbidity refers to which? A, the number of cases of disease per unit of population occurring over a unit of time. B, the first occurrence of menstruation. C, the number of deaths attributable to a particular per unit of population over a unit of time. The statistical likelihood of a person dying from a particular case. So morbidity specifically refers to the number of cases of disease. So remember, this is not the same as the number of deaths. Mortality refers to, and all the answer choices are the same as previously, so think about that one. Mortality is the one that refers to the number of deaths. Now let's look at specific types of infectious diseases that are called zoonoses. So these are diseases that are spread from animals. In our pre-domestication days or pre-agricultural days, what would have happened is that our primate ancestors definitely had parasites. We talked about how grooming can help remove things like lice or ticks off of the fur. So keeping your fur clean will improve your health. And there were definitely vector-borne illnesses as well, especially in the tropics, where flies, mosquitoes, and these other insects like to live. And when they bite one host, they pick up the bacteria or protozoan, and then they bite another host and transmit the illness that way. But post-domestication, we're going to have a lot more interaction with animals. So when you interact with a wild animal, you were probably only doing it for short periods of time while you were hunting it, butchering it, and then cooking it. And if you're cooking it, most bacteria, protozoans, and viruses are going to be destroyed in that process. So you're not going to get sick. However, when you have cattle or pigs or birds that are in your yard and you're interacting with them because you're feeding them and you're taking care of them and you're milking them, then there's a lot more opportunities for the pathogen that lives in that host animal to now jump to a human host. And some specific examples is that we know that the flu virus actually originated from birds and through birds and pigs made its way to humans. We also know that tuberculosis and measles has ancestral species from cattle. Leprosy most likely came from interactions with water buffalo. This is in Southeast Asia. And HIV, we actually think came from chimpanzees, our closest relatives. So why do we think that? There's evidence of SIVs in monkeys. So SIV is the simian form of the immunodeficiency virus, and there are many different versions of it. SIV only infects those specific monkeys or primates. It cannot infect humans. On the other hand, HIV infects humans, but it can also infect chimpanzees. So we think it's a mutated version that we actually got from a chimpanzee. Let's look at the changes in the types of diseases that humans were exposed to. So back in 1900, if you look at the chart on the left, you can see that the most common infections down here are what's causing death. So pneumonia, tuberculosis, these are both lung diseases, then gastrointestinal infections. Diphtheria is another one that affects your breathing, but things like cerebrovascular disease, so problems with the brain like stroke, and the incidence of cancer is relatively low. Then in modern times, so this is from 2010, what you see is that cancer and heart disease have taken the top spots. That's because people are living longer and the infectious diseases were almost completely eliminated due to the possibility of antibiotics and the presence of vaccines as a preventative. As I said, we're now switching back to this version because we're developing drug resistance. So let's look at cardiovascular disease in a little bit more detail since it is the #1 cause of death. Coronary heart disease, hypertension, and stroke all cause illness in our elderly population. And the biggest risk factor, as I mentioned, was the poor diet and the obesity. In addition, developing diabetes, which is associated with obesity, can then also increase your risk for CVD. Physical inactivity, smoking, because smoking does increase hypertension, and also different types of stress. Atherosclerosis is a specific type of disease that is the thickening of artery walls due to cholesterol buildup. So that one is definitely associated with diet. Cancer is the second leading cause of death. And what's happening there is that cells are programmed to divide a certain number of times. But with a cell that is cancerous, it is dividing uncontrollably. So it's no longer stopping the division process when it's supposed to. Instead, it keeps basically dividing infinitely unless you do something to kill it. So what's going on there is, again, there's risk factors. So obesity increases the risk for many cancers. Radiation, that's because UV light can damage your DNA, causing cancer. Exposure to carcinogens, those are chemicals in your environment. And now we know that there are many different things added to our food that has been shown to cause cancer in animal models. So it's possible that high consumptions of these overprocessed foods can develop cancer. There are some cases of viruses causing cancer. For example, HPV is the top cause of cervical cancer in women. And then even hormone production. There's a difference in cancer incidence between males and females. Males, the most common one is prostate cancer, which is part of his reproductive system, while in females, the top cause is breast cancer. And breast cancer is associated with elevated estrogen levels. There are some genetic predispositions to cancer where it doesn't necessarily mean you will absolutely develop cancer, but it means that there's a mutation there which makes it more likely for that cell to develop cancer if it's exposed to some of these other risk factors. Finally, I want to wrap it up by looking at the case study specifically of HIV because it is a disease that's very much in people's minds. So what happened with HIV is that it was discovered in the 1980s, but was probably already in the human population almost 100 years before that. What happened is the origin is in Africa. So what's going on with HIV is that, like I said, there was a simian form, and humans would have interacted with primates by hunting them and butchering them. So they were coming into contact with their blood. And we know that HIV is a blood-borne illness. So through repeated interactions with these primates, eventually the HIV mutated in such a way that it was able to infect human cells. And then it spread from those few people in Africa all the way across the globe. It made its way to North America, and we, of course, discovered it in the 1980s. We weren't sure what it was or how it was being transmitted, but now we know that it's mostly transmitted through sexually transmitted illness, right? So it's through sexual contact with body fluids, but also still through blood. So for example, people who share needles. And it's not the only disease coming out of Africa that we need to worry about. So a newer illness called Ebola, we think is coming from fruit bats potentially. So fruit bats in those areas have this virus, and then human interaction with them has caused it to jump species to humans. We've only had a few outbreaks of Ebola in history, but it is a very, very fatal illness. So it's definitely something to keep your eye on. Right now, we're kind of in the middle of a giant pandemic from coronavirus. So what is coronavirus? It's a virus that infects your lungs, and it's also thought to have an animal origin. This one came from Asia, and there are several other similar viruses that have caused SARS in the past. So those are respiratory syndrome problems. And this new version of coronavirus, as you know, has made its way all across the globe very rapidly. So when we're interacting with these animals, we do have to think about the health consequences of that. And that wraps it up for this chapter.